What a budget option for the Daytona, which is why I am dressed so country club aesthetic. I thought it would fit the Daytona, and in this case, a budget version of a Daytona. Now, while the Daytona has been popular for a long period of time, I've always been interested in the design aesthetic, but not spending $29,000, $25,000, $40,000 for a white dial Daytona. Introduce this. Now, from afar, from where you're sitting, you might even think that this is a Daytona, but it isn't. And I love the feature set on here for the price that you pay. Now, that isn't to say that it isn't without its flaws. All watches have their flaws, and we'll cover that near the end, where corners are cut or a new brand tries something a bit different, and it can cause more aesthetic issues in my opinion. But this watch largely nails it. The brand is Pitzman. They're from South Korea, or Seoul, South Korea, and this is their third model, so hence Pitzman 3. And they're obviously taking heavy design inspiration from you-know-who. Now, here's a shot of the two of them side by side, the Rolex Daytona and this Pitzman 3. I actually just did a video on the Daytona where I mentioned this watch at the end of that video. Link is above if you want to see my review of a Patrizi dial Daytona and a modern one. So think about it for a second. Let's say you want a chronograph that's similar to the Daytona. You want a vertical clutch column wheel movement. You want a ceramic bezel insert, a fully stainless steel watch with a milled clasp, and ideally a date where the Daytona doesn't have one. You wanted a bit more upscale as you already own or have worn watches over $5,000, let's say, but you don't want to spend as much on this watch. You just described this. At $1,500, this watch packs a heck of a punch. The specs generally, it's 40.9 or 41 millimeters diameter. Lug to lug is 47.3 millimeters. Lug width is 20 millimeters. Thickness is 13.4 millimeters. Water resistance at 50 meters. The movement is the Seiko 8R48, which is a vertical clutch column wheel movement. It does have double-sided AR or anti-reflective coating, and the power reserve is 45 hours. So obviously you can tell there are a lot of general specs that this watch fits great. You flip it over, you have on the back here this etched back end of the dial. I don't really look at the case back of my watch very often if it's a solid case back. If it has a sapphire case back where I can see through to the movement, occasionally I'll look at it, but honestly, I don't think I look at the back end of my watch very often. As I take it off here, you'll see the movement, and it's fairly utilitarian. You know, that being said though, the aesthetic of the movement, which is why it's covered up, isn't the point, it's the function. And this watch, the action of the chronograph here feels really solid, really snappy. And you know, a lot of times with these column wheel movements, what you'll have is a really difficult start where you can feel you're pushing hard enough to actually get it to go. And then your stop and your start again are both a little softer, but still just as snappy. In this case, I find all of them to be that perfect amount of, yes, I need to put some pressure on it, but it isn't so much that I'm like really trying to get the chronograph to start. There are a couple pusher styles and watches where that is the case, or in my experience, I haven't liked them as much. This one is really responsive, really snappy. Between that and the reset function, which just feels right, it's a feeling thing. These things can get tactile sometimes. Between this watch, my Zenith El Primero Chronomaster Original, and my Speedmaster. I've owned 3 Speedmasters now, both modern variants, the Sapphire and the Hesalite, and my vintage Speedy up there. This has the best feeling by far of any chronograph that I've owned. And that's down to the movement, not necessarily this specific watch, but the movement just feels great. So if you're out there looking for a budget column wheel vertical clutch movement, and the date indicator down at the bottom in this case is also a benefit to the movement that makes it more practical. There are a lot of red accents here on the date wheel, all over the outside of the watch, in the font, in the subdials, and even on the pusher. Now I'll cover more of the accents and my thoughts on those a little bit later. The dial here is a cold enamel dial, which I think is a bit misleading. It's a term used a lot in watches and when watch marketing, but it doesn't work the same way as normal enamel. See, normal enamel is a silica that's heated up and applied and then heated in an oven. That oven part very similar to how they fire ceramics. They do layers of this until they get to a final dial. Given the curing process, the repeated layers, and the fact that the oven has to be the correct temperature for the correct duration, the defect rate is rather high with cracks or any other defect forming on the dial. Cold enamel is just a resin base that's spread on a dial blank that hardens at room temperature. Very similar to like how epoxy works or any resin base. If you've ever seen the epoxy tables where they do those live edge tree tables where they put the resin on the top and they let it cure, it's the same sort of stuff. Now, the resulting look in this case is still awesome. It's more interesting and reflective than a standard lacquered dial. I like the look of this one actually quite a bit, but I just want everyone to know that cold enamel isn't quite the thing that you might be imagining if you're picturing them freezing enamel versus putting it in an oven like I did. Now, the black bezel insert on the outside, the ceramic, I think was necessary if you're trying to go for this functional look of it compared to the Daytona. I really like it. I like the black ceramic bezel on this, on my Submariner. Yes, they get a little shiny, but most of the time people don't watch what you're wearing. This is definitely more loud than like a Submariner is, just because of the dial being white and the sub dials with that reflective outside. It's definitely not a quiet watch, but I think that if you're going for this aesthetic, this is the best version. I said that in my Daytona review as well. I like the ceramic exterior bezel that is a little shinier, but I think it sets off the dial so well. The lugs on this watch do flare out a little bit, but they turn back down. There's a little bit of a chamfer here on the edge, but everything otherwise is pretty brush polished everywhere on the actual case itself. It wears a little thick, but not too thick. I mean, at 13.5 millimeters, it's pretty slim for an automatic chronograph. Those can typically get up to 14 to 15 millimeters sometimes. So it's pretty decent. It's right in that mid-range pack where it's not quite slim enough that you're just complimenting it for its slimness, but it's not too thick to where it noticeably is thick. This just feels like a sports watch. It feels right. So feeling wise, I think that's great. I have the weights of the watch also on here as well. I think the head weight and the bracelet weight are very important to point out, because sometimes if you have a watch where the head is really heavy, like you need to know that if you're going to put it on straps. And in my case, I don't like a thick, heavy bracelet very often. I think the Submariner is the only one I wear a little larger bracelet on. Usually I like my watches to be under 130 grams, all said, between the head and the bracelet. This one obviously is closer to 153 grams. That's why I have instead it on this Artem Hydro Flex strap with the white stitching. You can find a link down below. I wear these Artem straps all the time. I gave one to my dad and I think he's been enjoying it. So if you're interested in their straps, obviously I link them down below just because I wear them all the time. Now, at the end of each of these lugs, it is a little sharp, but it's not that noticeable. It's just something to note that some of the edges here that have been CNC'd or milled are a little on the sharper end. They haven't quite all been knocked down. You can easily do that with sandpaper or a file or whatever it is that you want to use to knock it down. I do that occasionally when I have a watch that's a little too rough. You can knock it down just a little bit, and that way it's a little bit more comfortable. So generally, what do I like? I like the movement. I like the pusher feel. I love the price at $1,500. I think it's just offering a great watch for a great price. I think the thickness is very wearable. The sizing and style are by far, like, it stands out to me. I've been wearing this a lot. I think this is the part of watch enthusiasm that is different than a lot of other hobbies. It's not just about scaling up the collection for better and better and better and more expensive watches. Like, I have watches in here that are 10 times the price of this watch here, but I've been wearing this for the last month or so. And that's because of the design aesthetic. So yes, while this is an affordable alternative, it feels like a watch that fits well into my collection. I think that this leaves very little left on the table that you need in order to make sense as to why you're spending $25,000 on a Daytona or this for a fraction of the price. That doesn't mean that it's perfect. There are a lot of things in here that I don't like the red accents that are all over the place. I think are fine for the most part. Underneath the logo was fine for me. Even on the pusher here and some of this chapter ring notes of red, I think looked cool. Like they were a nice little accent. When it got into the subdials, it started to affect legibility, I think, a little bit for me, where it's a little harder to notice where those hash marks are unless you're in really bright light. But you could pass it because you can still read it. The date is a problem for me. The red date down at the bottom is just not my favorite. It is loud, it's noticeable. Like the date should tuck away until you want to look at it. You know, I'm fine with them rimming the date and even with them cutting out the subdial because I know a lot of people like a 6 o'clock date versus like a 4:30 that you find on a lot of chronographs. I'm fine with the placement, but the red numerals is just like, you took the red accent just a step too far, in my opinion. If that could be dialed back, and they do have a blue variant of this as well, which does not have all this red everywhere. So if you watch but you don't like the red accents, you could look at that in their blue variant, which looks a lot like a platinum Daytona. The watch is obviously also a bit heavier, but that's par for the course in a lot of watches these days that you're going to buy with a solid bracelet. I just don't wear my watches on a bracelet when they are that heavy, so I put them back on a strap. That's not a big deal. If you like bigger watches or 150, 160, 170 grams on your watch, or you're used to that, especially if you're used to Seikos, then don't listen to me. I'm just used to a little bit lighter feeling on my watches. That being said, the edges of that bracelet were a tad sharp. Same thing as where the bottom of these lugs meet your wrist. You might want to knock them down a little bit, or just know that that's something to expect. The bracelet clearly was milled, but it didn't have the same level of chamfering on the edges of the bracelet that you would find on a watch that's more expensive, because again, you're buying a watch for a fraction of the price. The concept here is that you want a vertical clutch column wheel chronograph that's an alternative to a Daytona for 1/10 of the retail price of a Daytona, for 5% of the resale price of a Daytona, that has the same great aesthetic and will give you, a great watch right out of the gate, which will last you just as long. That is what this watch offers. So if you're willing to forego some of those nitpicky elements, then definitely check this out, the Pitzman 3. The link to their website is also in the description below. Big thanks to Pitzman for sending this in for a review. What do you guys think about it? Are you going to pick one up? Have you already picked one up? What about their other model lines? I didn't know they existed until about a month ago. So let me know in the comments below. And I'll see you in the next one. Take care.